Bates Motel, Season 1. Episode 1. Norman Bates stumbles to the garage as if awakening from a dream and discovers his father Sam lying in a pool of blood. Norma, Norman's mother, is dragged from the shower despite the fact that she doesn't appear surprised by the body's presence. 6 months later, Norma decides to move her son and herself to White Pine Bay, Oregon, and buys the Seafarer Motel. Norman catches a fleeting sight of his mother through the upstairs window as he unpacks the car. Norman meets fellow student Bradley Martin and 4 of her friends while waiting for the bus, and they all get along with Norman. Dylan, Norma's older son, calls her on the phone. Dylan feels betrayed by Norma for leaving without telling him. Before Norma hangs up on him, he makes a money request. Miss Watson, Norman's instructor, is worried about the grades on Norman's transcript. She advises Norman to sign up for the track team in order to get involved. Due to his track practice, Norman is running late for dinner. Norma is upset by this because she had expected Norman to assist the motel more, but she reluctantly signs his authorization form. On the Bates' doorstep is Keith Summers. He is upset with Norma for purchasing the house and hotel, even though the property had been in his family for many generations before the bank foreclosed. Keith is dismissed by Norma in a confrontational manner. Later, Bradley and her pals knock on the door and request that Norman accompany them to the library. After disagreeing with his mother, Norman sneaks out of the upstairs window despite Norma's refusal. When Norman and Bradley reunite, Norman finds out that the girls are actually escorting him to a party. At the party, Bradley and Norman start to get closer, but her buddy Richard interferes. When Keith enters the home again, he rapes Norma and causes her to cut her hand in the process. Norman finally responds to her constant calls and strikes Keith with an iron. Keith is fatally stabbed by his mother while Norman goes to get first aid. Norma explains to her son that reporting Keith to the police will make their establishment known as the Rape and Murder Motel. Before she asks for his assistance in dressing the body in bedclothes and keeping it in a motel room bathtub until dawn, they dispute about his trip to the party. The body drops while being carried to the bathtub, leaving a blood stain on the motel carpet. To avoid suspicion, Norma advises them to remove all of the carpeting. In one of the rooms, Norman comes across a homemade manga book about bondage while ripping up the carpet. Deputy Zach Shelby and Sheriff Alex Romero pay the motel a courtesy visit, but Romero wants to take a look around. While the body is in the tub, he uses the restroom but never opens the shower curtain. The police leave without a hitch. The following day at school, Norman sees blood on his sneaker, which leads him to throw up in a cafeteria dumpster. Emma D. Cody, a young woman with cystic fibrosis who later becomes Norman's friend, notices this. Norma learns that White Pine Bay is exploring a highway bypass that would redirect traffic away from the motel while she is still in town. The following evening, Norma and Norman row out to a lake's middle and dispose of Keith's body. The Bates Motel sign has taken the place of the Seafarer Motel sign. More of the bondage comic, which depicts a girl getting shots, is read by Norman. The mother and son then had a brief conversation while observing the new motel sign. In another scene, a chained woman is shown getting an injection in her needle-tracked arm. The identity of the person giving the shot is not made clear. In episode 2, Norman is still enthralled by the bondage manga he discovered hidden beneath the motel carpet. Norman has concealed the tool belt he had near Keith Summers' corpse beneath his bed. Dylan, Norma's other son, arrives at the door because he has nowhere else to go. A car veers off the road in front of Norman as she waits for the bus with Bradley and her pals. Jerry Martin, Bradley's father, is located inside and is severely burned. Sheriff Romero informs Norma at the crash site that Jerry was burned when someone set fire to his warehouse. Dylan taunts Norma, who gives her son the responsibility of picking up a bed linen order for the motel. Near the scene of the collision, Romero finds Keith Summers' abandoned truck. He is informed by Norma that she has not seen Keith and that she does not know why he left the truck there. On a project for class, Emma and Norman plan to collaborate at the Bates residence. Bradley is given flowers by Norman at the hospital, but Richard steals the bouquet. Dylan encounters a Jerry Martin employee who is in mourning in the Candy Stick Strip Club. Dylan queries the source of the man's large sum of cash when he flashes it around White Pine Bay. Dylan and Norma dispute over their family as Dylan is reprimanded by the latter for arriving late with the linens. Dylan is revealed to be Norman's half-brother because Norma had two husbands. Norma acknowledges that the cash for the new house and the company came from the insurance payment for her late husband. The remnants of Keith Summers' blood in the kitchen are cleaned up by Norma and Norman. Dylan seems to enjoy Emma's presence at the house when she comes for Norman. Norma interrogates Emma incessantly regarding her life expectancy as well as her family and cystic fibrosis. Dylan teases Norma by making a joke about Emma and Norman kissing. Emma finds Norman's manga book in his bedroom when they are discussing their project. She makes a loan request. Norma has a noticeable scar on her inner thigh. Norma is questioned about Keith Summers by Romero and Deputy Shelby when they arrive at the residence. Romero confronts Norma on a witness's report that she was observed having a furious argument with Summers. Romero develops misgivings. He exits after Norma refuses to let him inside. Deputy Shelby and Norma enjoy coffee in the city. While both Shelby and she reject Romero's charges, she flirts with Shelby. She receives an invitation from Shelby to the Woodchuck Festival that evening. In front of Norman, Norma puts on various outfits. At the shipyard, Dylan and Gil are introduced by the proprietor of the Candy Shack. Gil queries Dylan about using a weapon. Norman discovers that Dylan has labeled Norma as the whore on his cell phone at home. The two brothers then get into a physical altercation as a result. Dylan prevents Norman from using a meat tenderizer to kill him. Shelby hints to Norma at the logging festival that residents of White Pine Bay earn their living in questionable ways. Retaliatory behaviors are not uncommon, bad things do happen. Upon observing Norman's wounds, Norma makes the decision to eject Dylan. Emma texts Norman to meet at her father's business. The displays of taxidermy that Norman notices there pique his interest. Emma translated Norman's manga into English for the plot. 4 Chinese girls enter the country illegally with the idea that if they work as housemaids for 7 years, they will be granted citizenship. They are actually compelled to have sex with a different man every day. Overdosing claims the life of one of them. By a shed in the woods, the other females are compelled to bury her. After that, the girls are bought into sex slavery. Emma recognizes the mountain lady face, which is near White Pine Bay, in one of the drawings. After Emma gives Norman a kiss, they start to look for the burial site. Dylan is called out by Norma for leaving. How did her second husband die? Dylan queries. Dylan also makes a suggestion that he thought about informing the insurance agent the truth about her marriage. Norma allows Dylan to remain. When Emma and Norman look for the burial site mentioned in the manga, they instead find a marijuana farm. They are being pursued by 2 armed men. They come across the shed from the illustration while fleeing but are unable to halt. Eventually, they return to Emma's Volkswagen Beetle and drive off. People stare at a man on fire hanging upside down as Norma drives through the town. Episode 3, What's Wrong with Norman? Dylan exercises gun-wielding menace in the hallway mirror. He informs Norma that due to his employment, he is unable to receive a carpet delivery. Regarding the men Emma and Norman saw in the marijuana field, she is afraid. She admits to Norman that she merely wanted to spend out with him and that she had no idea the manga might actually be real at first. Norman is adamant about receiving the book back. Norman has a fantasy in class that his test is a manga and that his instructor, Miss Watson, is being held captive. Norman loses consciousness after entering a trance. Along with the man he met at the candy stick, Dylan is now one of the new guards of the marijuana field thanks to his work. Norman's mother informs the physician that he has never experienced a blackout. To receive the carpet at the motel, she unwillingly departs from Norman at the hospital. Bradley visits Norman and watches a movie with him in his hospital bed while carrying the flower pot he previously bought her. Bradley's father continues to be in an artificially induced coma and has a poor outlook. Sheriff Romero carries out a warrant to search the Bates residence while the carpet is being delivered. Against the doctor's recommendations, Norma brings her kid out of the hospital and tells him about the search. When Norman gets home, he discovers that Keith Summers' tool belt is stolen after looking under his bed. Loudly he wonders what is wrong with him, Norman. Norman informs Norma that he retained Keith's belt and that it has been removed, much to her astonishment and shock. He can't explain why he retained it, either. Dylan learns from his partner that local people control the marijuana farm, which keeps White Pine Bay open for business. Norman found the manga diary in room number 4, so Emma and Norman went there. When Bradley sends Norman a text, she discovers it. Emma discovers a Chinese symbol on the bathroom sink, which makes her think that the deceased manga character once lived in that space. Deputy Shelby and Norma meet to discuss the search. Norma is instructed to meet him at his home later. Norma discovers at Shelby's home that Shelby took the belt during the search and that no one else is aware of it. He inquires about the scar on her leg, which Norma claims she got in a mishap as a young child. Shelby promises to look after Norma, and they share a kiss. Dylan says he studied pheasant hunting in South Dakota. They no longer communicate. His father is from Kansas. Dylan notices Norman's hospital bracelet as he returns to the home. Norman needs to separate from Norma, Dylan tells his brother. Norman cannot recall using a meat tenderizer to attack Dylan. While awaiting his mother's return, Norman nods off in her bed. When he finds out that Shelby is in possession of the belt, he becomes concerned that Shelby may use it against Norma. The belt was something Norman wanted to preserve as a souvenir, he confesses. Norma doesn't comprehend his desire for a reminder of a terrible incident. Norman and Bradley are having a talk at school when Emma enters the room. The Chinese character means lovely, as Emma reveals. When Emma declares that she intends to contact the police regarding the Chinese girl, Norman becomes agitated. Later, Norman resolves to grab the belt back from Shelby after imagining a discussion with his mother. After getting into Shelby's home, Norman wields a baseball bat to ward off a dog. He discovers a set of keys that open the basement door. Norman enters and finds a dungeon-like environment with a Chinese girl kept hostage. She begs for assistance just as Shelby gets home. Episode 4, Trust Me. Dylan rides past on a motorcycle and follows his brother to Shelby's home as Norman walks there. Just after Norman discovers the girl in the cellar, Deputy Shelby arrives home. Dylan pretends to be a lost driver asking for directions to a gas station as he knocks on the door. Although the girl pulls at Norman's ankle as he attempts to escape through the window and begs for assistance, the distraction provides Norman enough time. Dylan confronts Norman about breaking into Shelby's house at home, but Norman insists that nothing is wrong. Norman picks Emma up from Artful Artifacts the following morning and walks her to school. Norman is greeted by Emma's father, who informs him that his daughter will miss a week of school due to the virus. Mr. Cody also says that he hopes Norman would be kind to Emma because she has a crush on him. In one of Norma's motel rooms, Shelby and she meet up. When they leave, Dylan is outside on the porch. Shelby and Dylan exchange glances but keep quiet when discussing their encounter the night before. Bradley has a flower memorial for her father planted by the side of the road, and Norman notices it. She is consoled by Norman. Norma and Dylan cross paths in the kitchen. Dylan cautions his mother to exercise caution as he has little faith in Shelby. Norman is seen by Shelby while returning from the video store, but he acts as though he is not there. Norman is cornered by Shelby, who coerces him into going fishing so they can get to know one another. Mother is informed about Shelby's basement by Norman. Norma assures her son that she never said anything like that, and that Norman is prone to visions when he goes into a trance, when Norman claims that she urged him to go there. Norm disputes his mother's assertion. Norma examines the basement while Shelby is sleeping but discovers it to be empty. Norma alleges that Norman is envious of her friendship with Shelby. Norman claims he doesn't have faith in the deputy. As a result, there is a quarrel, and Norma yells at her son for being insane. When the prisoner girl grabbed him, Norman got a bruise on his ankle that he shows his mother. Shelby explains to Norman that they must have mutual trust while they are fishing. The marina calls for Shelby. A dead hand wearing Keith Summers' watch that was trapped in a fishing net has been found by Sheriff Romero. When Norman and Bradley go for ice cream, they become closer as they talk about death and sadness. She reveals that a hand was found by the police. To warn his mother, Norman dashes home. Romero wants to question Norma, the deputy who has arrived tells her. Norma is informed by Sheriff Romero that carpet fibers found below Keith's watch will be compared to the carpet Norma removed from the motel. Norma disputes the charge. Romero inquires as to where the carpeting was dumped because he has not yet found it. Norma claims she can't recall. The dumpster where they dumped the carpet is empty, despite Norma and Norman's best efforts to search it. As Norma approaches the landfill, she becomes enraged when she is unable to pass the barrier. She is calmed by Norman, but at home he overhears her sobbing in her bedroom. Dylan is discovered by Norman outside the motel, and he tells Dylan what transpired with the female in Shelby's basement, the belt, and Keith Summers' murder. Dylan promises to support his brother. Dylan persuades Norman to visit Bradley after he receives a text from the latter. Bradley is still being consoled by Norman in her bedroom. They end up kissing and having a private moment. Dylan informs Norma that Norman is with a female as he searches for his mother's son. When Norma hears Dylan accuse the girl of stealing Norman from her, she begins to strike Dylan. As the doorbell rings, Dylan leans her up against the wall. Keith Summers' murder is the reason why Sheriff Romero detains Norma. Episode 5, Ocean View. After their night together, Norman walks home with a smile on his face, leaving Bradley dozing in her bed. He learns through Dylan that Norma is imprisoned. When Norman and his brother visit their mother, she rejects their offers of assistance. Norman looks for the motel deed at the motel office so he can use it as collateral for Norma's $100,000 bail. Norman discovers the act as Emma arrives. Norman is driven to John's bail bonds by Emma. Dylan asks Ethan, the person who brought him into their field of employment, if their employers would grant him a $5,000 advance so that he could purchase a home. Ethan chuckles. Norma is fed by Shelby in her cage. Norman tells Emma that he discovered the manga girl while they wait for John's bail bonds to open, but he is unable to give further details because the girl has since vanished. Emma gives Norman a kiss. Later, Bradley does not reply to Norman's text messages. Norman waits with flowers for his mother's discharge the following morning. Norma won't talk to her son. Rebecca Craig, an attorney, meets with Norma and Norman. Norma vehemently maintains that she had nothing to do with the murder of Keith Summers, while Rebecca tries to come up with a self-defense defense. Norman informs his mother that she is being unreasonable while they are driving home. Norma feels aggrieved that while she was battling the circumstances leading up to her incarceration, Norman was getting laid. She hears Norman admit that he fears her. Norma becomes irate and ejects her son from the vehicle. Dylan picks up his brother while passing by on his motorcycle as Norman makes his way home. At home, Dylan tells Norman that in order to get away from Norma, he is getting his own house and that Norman should move in with him. Ethan gives Dylan a $5,000 loan in town to cover his rent. When a burnout who knows Ethan approaches their truck, he shoots Ethan in the neck. Dylan rushes Ethan to the hospital and leaves him there. Norma speaks with Deputy Shelby, who advises her to put their relationship on hold for a while. Shelby stops Norma and tells her "I love you" as she is about to leave angry. In the end, they embrace and kiss each other. Shelby keeps Regina the receptionist busy at the police station while he removes a carpet fiber from evidence and turns off the security cameras. Dylan runs over the shooter of Ethan while he is in his car. Keith Summers' boat registration titles are the subject of Emma's study. Rebecca Craig phones Norma and informs her that the case has been closed because the police were unable to get the fiber sample. Bradley receives an embarrassing phone message from Norman. Norma informs her son that the murder accusation has been withdrawn, most likely as a result of Shelby's intervention. Norman leaves the house as a result of Norma praising Shelby. Norman is picked up by Emma as he descends the exterior stairs. Emma explains to him that she had the suspicion that Shelby might be hiding the girl on a Summers property now that Keith is deceased, if Shelby and Summers were partners in the sex slave trade. Norman admits to Bradley that they had a sexual encounter and are now dating to Emma. Emma informs Norman that it wasn't the beginning of a relationship, rather, it was just a hookup. Invading Keith Summers' boat, Norman and Emma locate the Chinese girl held hostage. Emma and Norman drive the young woman back to the hotel. When Norma enters the space, her son informs her that the girl in the chamber is the one from Shelby's basement. Norma rejects Shelby's guilt as the culprit. She takes a newspaper out of the filing cabinet that features a photo of Deputy Shelby taken during the Woodchuck Festival. After that, the Chinese girl positively identifies Shelby as the man who imprisoned her in his home and engaged in sexual activity with her. Episode 6, The Truth. Norma rushes to her car in order to confront Shelby as Norman and Emma converse. Norman leaps out the passenger side window and reaches out to seize the steering wheel. Norman is able to grab the keys and chuck them out the window after going in circles. In order to get his mother to be patient with Shelby, Norman calms her down. In a meeting with Gil, Dylan informs him that Ethan and Ethan's killer have both passed away. Gil gives Dylan instructions on how to get rid of the truck, which Dylan later sets ablaze. A man named Remo picks up Dylan. Remo, who currently works for Dylan, says he was dispatched by Gil. Xiao, the Chinese sex slave, is cared for by Norma. Xiao should be reported to the authorities, says Emma. Norma and Norman persuade Emma to wait, knowing they can't involve the police. Emma and Norma also have a special moment together. To take Keith Summers' tool belt, Norma intends to meet Shelby. Norma responds that she made up the tale about Norman's blackouts when Norman asks whether there is anything wrong with him. Dylan is made aware of his eavesdropping. He decides to search for the belt by returning to the boat with Norman. Dylan informs Norman en route that he has put down a deposit on a 2-bedroom apartment and desires for his brother to move in with him. Dylan queries Norman about the manner of his father's death while they examine the yacht. Dylan thinks Norma murdered Sam Bates. After discovering the belt, Dylan dumps it into the river. Shelby arrives at the Bates residence in the meantime. Although Norma finds it difficult to act as though Shelby is well, their conversation finally moves into a hotel room. In another hotel room, Shelby can hear water running. He draws his revolver and begins to look about. Xiao answers the door when Norma tries to make up a painter staying in the room. Xiao sprints away as she sees Shelby. As Shelby fires a shot at Xiao, Norma catches him. Norma is knocked to the ground by Shelby as she chases the young woman. Norman and Dylan show up. Norman is relocating with Dylan, who informs their mother of the news. Shelby is mentioned to the boys by Norma, who is suddenly more worried about Norman leaving. She denies killing Norman's father when he asks if she did. At gunpoint, Shelby enters the house and forces the three of them inside. What should Shelby do with his hostages? Shelby muses. When Norman punches Norma, he enters a trance and starts to attack Shelby. Dylan seizes a gun during the subsequent chaos. He starts a shootout with Shelby that spreads around the home. Norman, who injured his head while charging Shelby, is being cared for by Norma. After dragging Norman outdoors, Norma makes a police call. Shelby follows Dylan as he flees to a bedroom to reload his gun. After loading Norman into her car, Norma hears and sees 3 gunshots coming from the house. Shelby trips outdoors and passes away on the stairs. Norma meets her oldest son with an embrace as Dylan follows. Dylan claims he will inform the cops of everything. Norma confesses that Norman, who claims not to remember, killed Sam Bates while he was in a trance. Dylan is persuaded by Norma that they must lie to the police in order to keep Norman safe. Episode 7, The Man in Number 9. When Sheriff Romero gets there, he checks Shelby's body in the Bates residence. Romero fabricates a tale to portray himself as the shooter who killed the deputy after hearing the Bates version of events, claiming to have learned about Shelby's corruption. The Bates family decides to accept Romero's assertion and distance themselves from the situation because Shelby is also held responsible for Keith Summers' death. Dylan finds it offensive that Romero is given credit for eliminating Shelby. Dylan observes his mother and brother's celebratory odd embrace. Norman has sex fantasies involving Bradley. Norman finds a stray puppy while mending the porch's lattice. Even after learning of his brother's health, Dylan still intends to move out, which upsets Norma. Dylan encounters an enigmatic man searching for Keith Summers and the Seafarer Motel while taking out the trash. When Norman returns to school, Bradley is distant with her. As a result of the Summers and Shelby scandals, Norma discovers that the surrounding community and businesses are wary of her and the motel. A man tries to enter room 9 and is seen by Norma. Jake Abernathy, who goes by that name, says he had a regular reservation for room 9 on the first week of every other month. He is given the place to rent when Norma obtains a new key. The individual in room 9 turns out to be the same person Dylan encountered earlier that day. Dylan tries to get the man's credit card and driver's license in exchange for information, but the man only gives cash. Abernathy says he is employed in sales. Dylan makes an effort to persuade his mother that Shelby's blood cannot be removed from the stone steps. Bradley passes by while the brothers are in town and meets Dylan. As they leave ways, she and Dylan exchange glances. Noises downstairs cause Norma to awaken, which later reveal to be a door in the wind. When Emma comes to visit, Norman asks his mother to tell him a falsehood so he can avoid her. Norma chooses to accompany Emma on her errand after she begins to cry. Emma informs Norma about Norman's fascination with Bradley as they are driving. The two women stop by a yoga studio so that Norma can see what Bradley looks like because Mrs. Bates is curious about him. Realizing Bradley is the woman who drove Norman to the party after they initially arrived in town, Norma sees visions of her son having sex with Bradley. For feeding the stray dog, which he has called Juno, Norma chastises her son. Norman wants to keep the dog because it is natural to have a family pet. Norma makes an attempt to convince her son that Bradley is not a decent girl and that he shouldn't have sex with her. She also says that Emma was employed part-time by the motel by her. Norman feels betrayed by his mother's treatment of Bradley while championing Emma. Norman rushes to Bradley's home. Bradley informs Norman that she is not interested in dating him and that she should not have engaged in sexual activity with a man of his caliber. As he leaves, Norman is in a trance and keeps telling himself what his mother said about Bradley. Bradley follows after him. She receives his message that he does not consider her to be a nice girl. She apologizes and gives him a hug. Abernathy and Norma come to an agreement whereby all the rooms will be rented for a week every 2 months. When Norman is outside the motel, he sees Juno. She ignores his calls and is struck and murdered by a passing car. In order to cure Juno, Norman wants to take her to Emma's father and blames himself. Norma calls the notion crazy, which makes her son lose his cool. After then, Norman admits to his mother that he was mistaken about Bradley. To take Norman to see Emma's dad, Norma dashes for the car. Episode 8, A Boy and His Dog. Mr. D. Cody starts instructing Norman in the craft of taxidermy using Juno's corpse. Emma defends Norman by confessing that he had sex with Bradley after she overhears some schoolgirls making nasty remarks about him. After reading about the bypass construction in the newspaper, Norma tries calling Sheriff Romero. She also observes Abernathy gazing at her home from the parking lot of the motel. Dylan is told by Gil to take Remo to Fortuna, California, to pick up some trimmers. In response to Emma telling the school that they had sex, Bradley confronts Norman. He should not have happened, she says, adding that she had a partner. Norman quits school outraged. Miss Watson tries to stop him, but Norman pushes her away with his flailing arms. While she cleans his room, Norma and Abernathy have a contentious talk. She plays coy and he asks her about Shelby. In order to influence the decision on the bypass, Norma meets with Romero and requests his support for her candidacy for the city planning committee. Romero makes it plain that he will not be intimidated and that he is reluctant to offer any favors for Norma. Emma is questioned by Norman as to why she notified Bradley's classmates. He begs her not to undermine his trust in him once more. Norma is told by Miss Watson and Principal Tom Hudgens about her son's behavior. They advise Norman to consult a school psychologist. Norma declines, but appeases the teachers by saying she would find Norman a private therapist. Remo and Dylan quarrel in a pub on their way to California to resolve Remo's grudge over Dylan's relationship with Gil. Dylan discovers that Gil is not the highest-ranking supervisor. Additionally, he learns that nobody leaves their profession. Norman is questioned by Norma about his outburst at school, and she begs him to do more to fit in. Will D. Cody listens to her worries about Norman's new interest in taxidermy, but he seems to allay them just a little. The marijuana trimmers are picked up by Dylan and Remo. Remo advises dumping the lead hippie because he was a hassle on a previous trip. Abernathy is followed by Norma to the marina, but he discovers her spying on him. Abernathy has a search in mind. He informs Norma that he is aware of Shelby and her. While he is on the top rung, he tells her that Keith Summers was on the bottom. The two of them visit a therapist. The therapist advises him to meet his mother and son separately after their joint session because Norma has a negative impact on Norman. Norma feels insulted. Dylan threatens the lead trimmer with a gun and orders him out of the van when he continues to act haughtily, which Remo likes. Abernathy is ordered to vacate the motel by Norma, who returns his money. Abernathy leaves the motel via car. They make up when Emma gives Norman an explanation of her conduct. Dylan transports the trimmers to the hotel so they can stay there. Norma is eager about the unexpected business and wants to meet Dylan for supper. Norma finds Shelby's body on her bed when she enters the house to change. Episode 9, Underwater. The marijuana cutters residing at the motel observe as Shelby's body is taken from the Bates residence. Norma shares with Sheriff Romero her concerns over Jake Abernathy. The mattress of Norma is dumped in the trash by her sons. The trimmers are instructed by Norma not to smoke marijuana on the motel porch. Norma expresses a desire to leave White Pine Bay. In his fantasies, Norman drowns Bradley. Norma instructs Emma to prohibit marijuana use by visitors at the motel while she is away. Flowers and a "see you soon" card are sent to Norma. Bradley asks Gil to let Dylan into her father's former office when he sees her in town and Dylan agrees. When Norma sees her realtor, she insists that he give her her money back and put the house back up for sale. Norman receives a request from Miss Watson to collaborate on a short piece he authored that she thinks ought to be published. Norma is cleaning a motel room when she notices a dark automobile passing by. Norman takes Juno's plush animal home. He expresses to his mother his desire to remain put. Dylan learns about Norman's dream. Gil is asked by Dylan about Jerry Martin's workplace. Dylan receives the office from Gil. After chastising trimmer Gunner for smoking marijuana at the motel, Emma befriends him. Norman and Miss Watson collaborate on his narrative. Abernathy's information is false, and Sheriff Romero informs Norma that he has no leads to help find or identify him. Bradley is seen by Norman at school. In the motel office, Emma discovers a marijuana cupcake that Gunner left for her. Bradley and Dylan meet, and Dylan offers to let her inside the office covertly. After arguing with Norma about moving, Norman accuses his mother of being crazy. Emma arrives at the house intoxicated. Norman expresses regret for labeling Norma as crazy. Remo fires at Dylan and Bradley when they break into Gil's. Remo permits the two to proceed to the office despite Gil's animosity toward the Martin family. Bradley discovers love letters from her father's lover B to Bradley. She is consoled by Dylan. Norma is afraid of her own room, so she sleeps in Norman's bed. Norman informs Miss Watson that he does not believe his mother will agree to him publishing his narrative. Norma learns that her property is submerged when she visits the realtor. When she returns to her car, Abernathy pulls a gun on her. According to him, Shelby owes him $150,000, and he believes Norma is in possession of it. In the event that Norma doesn't give Abernathy the money by the following day at midnight, he threatens to kill her family. Episode 10, Midnight. Sheriff Romero is informed by Norma of the altercation she had with Abernathy and his demand that she bring him $150,000 on the docks at midnight. Romero promises to take care of it, but he doesn't give any further information. Emma and Norman are both willing to attend the winter formal ball. Dylan declines to give Norma a gun when she asks. It becomes out that Romero has the cash that Keith Summers owes Abernathy. With Norman's therapist, Norma addresses her personal problems as well as her family background. During a distressing phone call, Norman hears Miss Watson arguing with a man by the name of Eric. She gives Norman a comforting hug. Maggie Summers, Keith Summers' sister and the sex trade operations bookkeeper, meets with Sheriff Romero. Jake Abernathy is known to her as Jeff Furetti. Romero queries her for information on where he might be. Emma points out Norma's leg scar to Mrs. Bates while Norma says that it was caused by a childhood accident. Emma is wearing a dress for the dance. Dylan makes the decision to give his mother a gun and takes her shooting. Norma is introduced to Maggie Summers, who forewarns her about Abernathy. Bradley visits the Bates residence in search of Dylan. From Gil's office, Norman listens in as his brother hands Bradley her father's possessions. Norman screams at Norma in anger before talking with his brother about Bradley. Norma tells Norman that she was molested by her brother while growing up in Akron, Ohio. She knocked over a hot iron in a hurry while having sex with her brother, and as their father unexpectedly returned, she sustained the scar on her leg. In order to confirm their midnight meeting, Abernathy phones Norma. Emma becomes irritated and exits the dance as Norman keeps looking at Bradley. Outside, Richard, Bradley's lover, punches Norman and tells him not to approach Bradley. When Norman is discovered wandering home in the rain, Miss Watson scoops him up. She makes the decision to bring Norman to her house to receive treatment after noticing the wounds on his face. When a car approaches, Norma hides by the pier while carrying her rifle and a bag full of clothing. Romero comes out and stands by for Abernathy. Romero shoots Abernathy dead into the lake after pretending to work out a new business deal with him. Romero, who knew Norma was hidden the entire time, throws the money bag after him and urges her to go home. Norman's face is cleaned of blood by Miss Watson, who then retreats to her room to get dressed. The bedroom door is left ajar, allowing Norman to observe her undress. He imagines his mother critiquing the circumstance and saying, "You know what you have to do," towards the end. When her kid runs home, Norma welcomes him without remembering how the evening with Miss Watson ended. Miss Watson is pictured lying in a pool of blood on the floor of her home. A necklace with the letter B is worn around her slit throat.